In an age when nuclear weapons are a reality, we as a nation should be prepared with as much knowledge as possible about protection and survival from attack by these weapons. The primary responsibility of farmers and agricultural leaders in such a catastrophe would be twofold: to protect the farm family and their ability to produce food and other essential agricultural products required for our existence. The study of nuclear weapons and their effects is relatively new. Past and present research has developed knowledge and will continue to provide us with information useful for our protection. Research studies are extensive, and our fund of dependable knowledge continues to grow. This motion picture is directed to you, you the farmer, you the agricultural leader, in an effort to prepare you for protection against a nuclear attack. In helping to protect our land, our crops, our livestock, ourselves from such an attack, we face a major problem: the effects of radioactive fallout, or simply fallout. First, let's look at what actually goes on in a nuclear explosion. At this moment, three destructive phenomena are at work: heat, blast, and initial radiation. A fourth, residual radiation, produces its effects later and over a much longer period and larger area. Now let's back up and see how fallout is actually made. When a nuclear explosion occurs, a huge, intensely hot fireball is immediately formed. Its temperature rivals that of the sun, millions of degrees Fahrenheit. All of the bomb materials within this fireball are, of course, vaporized. This highly heated fireball begins to rise promptly. In the immediate area of detonation, thousands of tons of pulverized earth are carried aloft and mixed with radioactive particles in the hot gases of the atomic cloud. In this cloud, some of the earth and debris are melted or vaporized. Radioactive material from the bomb itself becomes absorbed in the melted material, or it sticks on the surface of the solid particles. These particles range in size from those visible to the naked eye to those that are invisible. Together, they are called radioactive fallout. The danger of this fallout stems from the nuclear radiation emitted from radioisotopes produced when the bomb explodes. About 1/2 of it returns to Earth within 12 hours after the explosion. The rest descends gradually over days and weeks. Extremely small particles carried into the stratosphere may not return to Earth for years. Size of fallout particles, together with wind, rain, and other atmospheric conditions, determines largely when and where they fall to the Earth's surface. Where fallout drops in large quantities, it is a source of radiation that can be damaging to man and animals. The immediate and most serious danger would be from early fallout. Thousands of square miles may eventually be affected. 3 different kinds of radiation are associated with fallout. The first 2, alpha and beta particles, may be dangerous if they lodge on the skin or if they're taken in with contaminated food, water, or air. The third, gamma rays, are like X-rays. Because they are highly penetrating, they can damage all tissues of man and animals, even though fallout particles do not enter the body. Part of this radiation can pass into and through matter. When it does, we get a destructive process known as ionization. This process damages and destroys living cells and inhibits normal cell growth and replacement. Now, the intensity of fallout radiation begins to decrease the very moment the radioisotope is formed. This process is called radioactive decay. At the time of nuclear detonation, many different kinds of radioisotopes are produced. Each isotope decays at a specific rate. These decay rates are measured in terms of half-life, the time required for a given amount of a radioactive isotope to lose half its radioactivity. These half-lives vary from a mere fraction of a second to many years. Iodine-131, for example, a common isotope in fallout, has a relatively short half-life of 8 days. That means for every 8 days that pass, this isotope continues to lose 1/2 its strength until its importance as a hazard is negligible. On the other hand, strontium-90 has a much longer half-life of 28 years, but more about individual isotopes later. Now, what about a mixture that contains all of the radioisotopes produced during a typical nuclear explosion? Do we know what the decay rate of such a mixture would be? Yes, we have a pretty good idea. Let's use some simple arithmetic. A rule of thumb is that for every 7-fold increase in time after detonation, gamma radiation intensity decreases by a factor of 10. Let's start at 1 hour after the detonation with 1,000 Roentgens per hour. Now, 7 hours after the explosion, the original 1,000 Roentgens per hour would have decreased to 1/10 of that rate, or simply 100 Roentgens per hour. With another 7-fold increase in time, or 49 hours after the explosion, there would be an additional decrease by a factor of 10 to 10 Roentgens per hour. By the end of 7 times 49 hours, or 343 hours, that's approximately 2 weeks, we have still another decrease by a factor of 10 to 1 Roentgen per hour. Let's consider the external hazard. A natural protection factor is distance. As would be expected, radiation exposure from a nuclear burst or from fallout is less the farther away we are from the point of burst or from fallout deposits. The principal form of early protection, however, is shielding or shelter. Shelter for you and your family and for your livestock. The first 48 hours after detonation are critical, but you should be prepared for a longer period of time, as much as 2 weeks or even longer. In a fallout area, the first floor of an ordinary wood frame house would provide a protection factor of about 1/2. That is, you would receive about 1/2 the radiation dose inside the house than you would outside with no protection. In the cellar, your exposure would be much less, only about 1/10. An underground shelter with a covering of 3 feet of packed earth would provide most effective protection. In addition to shelter, don't forget ample food, water, first aid supplies, batteries, lights, and sanitary facilities. Similar protection should be given your livestock and poultry. Proper use of shelter can reduce the number of deaths from radiation. We should remember that any type of shelter provides some degree of protection. A good tight barn would reduce the radiation by about 1/2. Here again, provision of clean, safe feed and water must not be overlooked. Now we come to the matter of the internal hazard. This occurs when we consume contaminated food and air. Some radioactive elements in fallout are retained in the body for a long time. Rays from these elements then continue to damage the cells with which they come in contact. Since it does affect most food commodities, this hazard is of major concern to agriculture. At first, the principal source of the internal radiation hazard is fallout particles adhering to edible vegetation. For livestock, this would primarily involve pastures. For man, fruits and vegetables. As time passes, directly contaminated food that is also highly contaminated is discarded. The source of internal radiation for animals and man then becomes the contamination in the soil, which is naturally absorbed through the plant, its leaves and its roots. Under these conditions, the radioactive elements are literally locked within the new crop. Without proper precaution, they could be hazardous to man and animals, for they may become incorporated in the food chain. The food chain is the normal movement of nutrients in the following way: from soil through plant tissue, becoming food for man or feed for livestock, and through animal tissue, becoming meat and milk for man. After the first few days, the radioactive isotopes most significant as internal radiation hazards are iodine-131, strontium-90, which we touched on earlier, and cesium-137. There are other isotopes produced by a nuclear explosion, but for one reason or another, they are of less individual concern. The amount produced may be small, the half-life short. The isotope may not become incorporated in the food chain, or it may not be retained anywhere in the body. When fallout is heavy, a personal, external radiation hazard exists if you harvest fruits, vegetables, and grains right away. Ripe fruits may be lost before there is enough radioactivity decay to assure safe harvesting. Fruits not yet ready for harvesting can probably be saved. This is particularly true for thick-skinned fruits, which do not suffer serious contamination. Vegetables as well as fruits should be thoroughly washed and peeled and eaten only when they are known to be free of hazardous amounts of radioactivity. Forage crops standing in the field during heavy fallout would not be usable. The existing crop should be cut and removed to a location presenting little hazard to man or animals. Succeeding crops of deep-rooted plants such as alfalfa might be used. Let's have a closer look at the radioactive isotopes causing the most significant internal radiation damage to man and beast. Iodine-131, when consumed, collects in the thyroid gland and would irradiate that organ of the body. Dairy animals can transfer some of this isotope to their milk. Because of its short half-life of 8 days, its threat virtually disappears in from 2 to 3 months. Chemically, cesium-137 resembles potassium. It is distributed in soft tissues, such as the muscles. But like potassium, it leaves the body quite rapidly. Strontium-90 presents another story. Chemically, it is similar to calcium and collects in the bones where it remains for years. Part of it is secreted into the milk. Because strontium-90 is produced in large quantities during nuclear explosions, let's give this serious consideration. Since strontium is very much like calcium, plants, animals, and man absorb it in similar fashion, but in much smaller amounts. Strontium goes from the soil, or from plants growing in the soil, into the bodies of animals. A negligible amount goes into the muscle and is present in the meat we eat. Another portion goes into the milk. But the cow's body has a preference for calcium over strontium in converting the feed to the milk we drink. Some of the strontium contained in this milk reaches the bones of man. Now suppose we consider the relationship between strontium-90 and calcium as far as the average human diet in the United States is concerned. Of the calcium that enters the body in food, 80% is derived from milk and cheese, 15% from such plant foods as greens, vegetables, and fruits, 5% from meat and eggs. Here is a normal diet containing calcium, represented by gold flecks. Here is the same diet contaminated with strontium, shown by silver flecks. Let's see how much of each would get to the bones. The human body has a preference for calcium over strontium. This helps avoid heavy accumulation of strontium in bones. The fraction of the strontium that is deposited in the bone is only 1/4 as great as the fraction of the calcium that is deposited. Of the strontium that is deposited there, 63% comes from plant foods, 34% from milk and cheese, and 3% from meat. Since milk and cheese offer so much calcium and proportionately little strontium, it would not be wise to substitute another source of calcium in our diets, except under conditions of extreme emergency. A body well nourished with calcium, so research on animals indicates, does not retain as much strontium as a body deficient in calcium. The removal of strontium is a major objective in decontamination of soils. Other radioisotopes may be present, but as we pointed out earlier, they are far less hazardous. Where acid soils are low in exchangeable calcium, more strontium is taken up by the plant. By liming such soils, however, more calcium is made available to the plant. Thus, more calcium and less strontium will be absorbed. This method would be useful in highly acid soils, on which liming would be normally beneficial for other reasons. At best, however, it probably can reduce the strontium-90 uptake to only 1/3 if the soil were not treated. Under certain conditions, the use of heavily contaminated soil may require changing the species of crops grown on the land. For example, the quantity of strontium-90 absorbed might be reduced by growing crops with low calcium content in their edible tissues. Such crops as tomatoes, potatoes, and corn might be chosen. Since some green leafy vegetables are high in calcium, it would be wise to replace them in the diet with a source of calcium that is comparatively uncontaminated. Land use might be diverted to non-food crops, such as cotton, flax, and lumber. Oilseed crops, such as soybeans, might also be considered. If only the top several inches of your soil are contaminated, the land might be diverted from shallow-rooted crops, like grasses and vegetables, to deep-rooted crops, say alfalfa. The deep-rooted plant gets its nutrients from deep in the soil, below the contaminated layer. Milk from cows grazing on pastures having highly contaminated soil could possess a high content of the radioisotope. Dairy farming might then have to be changed to the raising of beef cattle, for the strontium deposited in the meat would be insignificant. Hence, the meat could be used for food. Where local land is needed for production of essential foods, deep plowing might be considered. This operation would turn the contaminated surface soil below the root zones of shallow-rooted plants, and the plant would grow above the contaminated layer, thus reducing the uptake of strontium-90. Grasses and some vegetables might be grown under this condition. The decision to deep plow must be given serious consideration. For once the strontium is plowed under, it's located in the soil for a long time, where no effective method for its removal is known. So before deep plowing, consider other alternatives. Some methods have been devised for decontamination of soil. The present ones probably could be used only in small areas where land is needed for emergency crops. Decontamination by removal of ground cover is effective when the existing cover is thick enough. Cover provided by a sod or mulch of 2 tons of straw per acre is practically complete. Removing this cover would take away about 90% of the radioactivity. Contaminated material taken from the area must be stored where it will not be a hazard to man, animals, and food. Workers, of course, should avoid breathing the dust created in these operations by wearing respirators. Soiled clothing should be changed after leaving the field. Face and hands should be thoroughly washed before eating. The removal of surface soil is one of the most effective methods of decontamination, but currently developed procedures would not be suitable for large acreages. It might be useful, however, if small, clean areas are needed to produce food for survival. Scraping surface soil is partially successful for rough land and highly successful for smooth seed beds. The effectiveness is determined also by the amount of surface soil removed. Again, precautions must be taken against breathing the dust. Contaminated soil would have to be disposed in a way that protects it from erosion and prevents it from recontaminating cleaned areas. Yes, the problems in agriculture resulting from atomic attack would be serious indeed. But a word of encouragement. We are learning more and more about methods of protection. Even in areas where contamination may be heavy, remember, the use of proper shelters for sufficient lengths of time can considerably reduce the dangers of external radiation to you and your livestock. The research conducted by the United States Department of Agriculture in cooperation with other agencies is providing information and procedures that can be used to reduce the effects of fallout on agriculture. Through knowledge resulting from continuing research, we may expect these potential dangers to be reduced by planned emergency procedures and by planned use of our land and its products.
One moment, all is quiet in this reserve fleet berthing area. But the next, orders flash to a nearby shipyard. Attacked by underwater atomic bomb. Prepare to handle ships for decontamination. The handling of contaminated ships requires special facilities and procedures. The vessels may be brought into a part of the shipyard known as the decontamination zone, an area fenced off where workers and activities are isolated and carefully controlled to avoid the spread of contamination. All personnel must pass through a change station before entering and leaving the decontamination zone. This control point may be a floating barge converted to a change house or a special building ashore. On entering the change station, every man is required to strip to the skin and change to special clothing and equipment for protection against getting contaminated material on his body or from getting it into his system through breathing, eating, or getting it into cuts. By wearing film badges and dosimeters, the dose a workman receives is measured and recorded. These records help guard against overexposure. This is the initial survey and boarding party, which takes along survey instruments to detect and measure radiation and determine the condition of the ship. It consists of a ship superintendent, qualified to handle radiological decontamination, the pilot, monitoring teams, deckhands, and advanced planning people. Parts of the tug which may become contaminated by contact with the contaminated vessel should be adaptable to easy cleaning. Hull surfaces should be well painted and free from scale, rust, and marine growths. Hemp or jute fenders should be covered. Rubber tire fenders are easy to decontaminate. Such precautions are very important, not only for the safety of the people aboard, but also for the safety of others who work in the shipyard. As the tugs approach the contaminated ship in its berthing area, the monitors use their survey instruments to determine the radiation level. As a result of data given him by the monitors, the ship superintendent determines that the radiation level of the ship is not too high for the ship to be boarded immediately. As the tug moves up against the contaminated hull, the value of easily cleaned fenders becomes apparent. Ladders, lines, and everything else that contacts contaminated surfaces must be either easy to clean or disposable. The monitors go aboard first to determine the level of radioactivity topside. To avoid exposing its personnel unnecessarily to radiation, the tug stands off while the monitors make their survey. The monitoring teams take readings at various points topside. Readings are chalked on the surfaces as a guide to the boarding party that will follow them. The radiation readings are also reported by walkie-talkie to the ship superintendent on the lead tug, who evaluates and records the readings on the ship's plans in order to give a clear picture of general radiation levels topside. Beside providing the ship superintendent with radiation readings, the monitoring teams collect samples of radioactive dirt for further study and analysis of the existing dust hazard as required by the medical department. These samples must be carefully labeled for proper identification later. When the monitoring teams have finished their survey, the tug comes alongside to take them aboard. As they are tracking contamination from the ship, they stop on a marked area, take off their booties and gloves, and drop them in a disposable receptacle. Note the procedure. They take great care to avoid any skin contact with contaminated clothing. Clothing is checked for radioactive particles, and so is equipment. The men also take showers. Every precaution is observed to control radioactive particles and to keep them from being spread to clean areas. These precautions only begin here. After returning to the decontamination zone of the shipyard, the men will be processed through the change station. The results of the monitor's survey are reported to the command center for a decision whether to moor the ship in the yard or at a quarantine anchorage. Decontamination procedures and precautions at either site are the same. If the ship is ordered into the yard, the decontamination may be done at a pier, slip, or dry dock. Deckhands go aboard to handle the lines and prepare the ship for towing. Although a ship may become contaminated well out of range of heavy physical damage, some light structures may be affected by the blast and rendered unsalvable. As they are contaminated and will sink, it is best to dispose of them in the contaminated area before bringing the vessel into a clean shipyard. The members of the party are guided in moving about the deck by the radiation markings left by the monitors to ensure that they receive as small a dose of radiation as practicable. The advanced planning and survey party, which includes shipyard personnel, probably representatives of the reserve fleet and others, look over the ship and estimate the work to be done. Any line secured to the ship may become contaminated. As the manila or spring-lay tow lines cannot be decontaminated, they must not come in contact with the ship. Wire slings at the ends prevent this. Unlike the lines, the slings can be decontaminated. The deckhands and members of the survey party return to the tug as their presence is not required on the contaminated ship. With the pilot directing the operation, the ship is towed to the shipyard decontamination zone. The dry dock, as well as the decontamination zone which surrounds it, is planned, outfitted, and operated not only to facilitate decontamination, but to avoid the spread of radioactive particles. The manila lines used here also have wire slings at their ends to prevent direct contact with the contaminated ship. Like the boarding and survey party, the docking party should wear special clothing, film badges, and dosimeters. Everything that contacts the contaminated ship should be distinctively marked and as easy to decontaminate as practicable. Yard services must be supplied temporarily. However, even portable blowers must not be operated until the compartments have been monitored, dust conditions evaluated, and the spaces declared safe for their use. The underwater body and the dry dock should be monitored immediately to permit calculation of acceptable work periods. Later, there will be detailed monitoring throughout the ship. Marine growths tend to hold contamination. They should not be allowed to dry out, as this may make an inhalation hazard. They should be removed while wet with long-handled scrapers. These growths drop into the dry dock where they are kept wet. They are then disposed of with caution and the dry dock decontaminated as necessary. When the men are ready to secure, they must pass through the change station as they leave the decontamination zone. This applies to the boarding and survey party, the docking gang, and everybody else in the zone. In the change station, the men take off their special clothing and leave it, as well as their decontamination equipment. They wash themselves thoroughly with soap and water to remove any radioactive particles which may have gotten through the special clothing. Glasses are the only personal articles which men are allowed to take through the change station. Then they must be checked and passed by the monitor to make sure they are free of radioactive particles before they are allowed to pass into the clean area of the change station to put on their regular clothes. The change station procedures are a rigid safeguard to prevent decontamination workers from carrying away radioactive particles. In summary, the initial survey and boarding party must be equipped with special clothing and gear as well as survey instruments. All equipment which comes in contact with the ship should be distinctively marked and as easy to decontaminate as practicable. All shipyard facilities and equipment contacting the contaminated ship should be distinctively marked and easy to decontaminate. Remember, we can't see radiation, feel it, or hear it. We can detect it and measure it. And what's more important, we can work with it without risk if we use our heads and follow the prescribed procedures.
On the morning of the 6th of August, 1945. A city crowded with businessmen, shoppers, people on the way to work. Overhead, an airplane passes, scarcely noticed. One fraction of 1 minute, one airplane carrying one bomb has so devastated a city that only an expert could distinguish it from Carthage or Troy, Coventry or Warsaw, Berlin or Tokyo. One plane, one bomb, one city. A weapon of matchless destructiveness has opened up new horizons of offensive warfare. The atomic bomb casts a searching light on present concepts of strategy and tactics, and on the overall problems of national defense. Atomic weapons have become the central fact of diplomacy and international relations. Federal and state authorities labor under a new burden of responsibility. On city and local administrations, the shadow of atomic eventualities falls with a new urgency. On the medical profession, on those who must treat the casualties of any disaster, the implications of the atom lie especially heavy. For while the atom bomb is a military weapon, to the individual practitioner and to the potential victim, it is essentially a medical problem. All matter, liquid, gaseous, or solid, is composed of minute particles known as atoms. Particles so small that billions upon billions are contained in a single grain of table salt. A grain of salt under a microscope lens discloses fine details of shape and form. The electron microscope, with its magnification of 100,000 times or more, brings ultimate reality one step nearer. If it were possible to magnify matter several thousand times again, the molecules of chemical compounds would become visible, made up of their component atoms. With even greater magnification, the atom itself. Deep within the atom, occupying only a small fraction of its total volume, lies the nucleus. The source of the energy in the atomic bomb is the large, complex, and unstable nucleus of plutonium or uranium-235. The energy is released in a process known as nuclear fission. In fission, a nuclear particle known as a neutron strikes and splits the nucleus of uranium or plutonium. Between 1 and 3 neutrons are released. If enough uranium or plutonium is present, the neutrons may strike and split still other nuclei, and the process continues. This is the chain reaction which takes place in the atom bomb. In the chain reaction, the nuclear fragments of fission fly apart with violent force. With increased motion of the atoms, the temperature rises. At higher temperatures, thermal energy is given off, first as infrared radiation, then as visible light, and finally as ultraviolet radiation. Within a fraction of a second after detonation, the thermal energies of the chain reaction are converted to mechanical energy in a climactic explosion. The chain reaction, an atomic furnace in which mass is consumed and energy is produced on an immense scale. In fission, the energy of particles in motion is converted to thermal and mechanical energy. These are conventional energy forms associated with explosives such as gunpowder and TNT. They represent about 80% of the total energy output of fission. The remaining 20% takes the form of nuclear radiations. Nuclear radiations are not new in medical experience, but are given off by radioactive materials such as the radium in a luminous watch dial and in some types of medical therapy. Normally, radium gives off radiation in all directions, but if confined, the radiation may be limited to a single beam. If the beam of radiation passes through a strong magnetic field, it is split into 3 parts. One beam of positively charged particles is bent in one direction. This positively charged beam is composed of alpha particles. A second beam of negative charge is deflected in the opposite direction. This negatively charged beam is composed of beta particles. The remainder of the radiation, which is not affected by the magnetic field, has no electrical charge and is known as gamma radiation. These same radiations are also associated with the fission reaction in the atom bomb. When a uranium or plutonium atom splits, the neutrons emitted are accompanied simultaneously by gamma rays. The fragments of the original atom are radioactive. They return to stability by giving off gamma rays and beta particles. The neutrons left over from the fission reaction may be captured by normally stable atoms, rendering them artificially radioactive, a source of beta and gamma radiations. When fission occurs on a large scale, some uranium or plutonium is left over from the fission reaction and is a continuing source of alpha radiation. The range of alpha particles in air is measured in a few inches. Alpha particles are almost entirely absorbed by a few sheets of ordinary writing paper. Beta particles have a range in air of several feet, but are effectively filtered out by several thin sheets of aluminum. Gamma rays are the same as X-rays of equal energy. They are extremely penetrating. Gamma penetration depends upon the atomic weight or density of the material. Light substances such as wood are quite ineffective as a filtering material against gamma rays. Heavier materials such as concrete are considerably more effective in filtering the radiation. Lead, a very heavy element, is a highly efficient shielding material against gamma rays. In contrast to gamma rays, neutrons are less affected by heavy elements such as lead and may penetrate considerable thicknesses. Neutrons are stopped more effectively by water and other light materials which contain large amounts of hydrogen. The range and penetration of nuclear radiations varies similarly in tissue. Alpha particles are absorbed by the outer layers of the skin. Beta particles penetrate through the skin into the subcutaneous layers. Neutrons are very highly penetrating in tissue, as are gamma rays. Although nuclear radiations vary in penetration, they all have the same destructive effect on tissue cells. In general, radiation causes ionization in the component atoms of cells, altering their chemical nature and impairing or destroying their normal functions. Alpha particles cause intense ionization, but are chiefly absorbed by the dead outer layers of the skin and do little damage to the living tissue beneath. Beta particles penetrate deeper but cause less ionization. They may result in serious damage to the skin and superficial tissues. Neither alpha nor beta rays causes serious damage to deep tissues unless the source of the rays is inside the body. Neutrons travel an erratic course and lose their energy after colliding with several other atoms. Under the impact of the neutrons, light hydrogen atoms in the tissue fly off at high velocities, producing ionization in neighboring cells. On striking tissue, gamma rays eject beta particles from atoms within the cells. The beta particles, in turn, cause ionization in the local tissue. With gamma rays of low energy, the most intense ionization of tissue cells is produced in the superficial layers. With gamma radiation of higher energy, the peak of ionization is in the deeper tissues, and effective ionization occurs throughout the entire body. With whole body radiation, ionization causes loss of function of the more sensitive tissues and organs. The degree of loss depends upon the dosage. If the exposure is both general and severe, death results. Fissioning materials are a source of three types of potentially destructive energy: nuclear radiations, thermal energy and mechanical energy accompanying the reaction, and residual radiation from the fission products. All these forms of energy are released in fantastic quantities within a fraction of a second after the detonation of the bomb. First, there is an emission of thermal energy. gamma rays, and neutrons. Depending upon the altitude of the burst, the neutrons reach the target in large or small quantities, or not at all. The gamma rays extend far from the target center. A massive pressure wave and winds of cyclonic velocity inflict great destruction on the target. The fireball shoots into the stratosphere, forming a mushroom cloud composed of steam, superheated gases, and vaporized metal, a source of radioactivity until dispersed by prevailing high-altitude winds. The effect of the explosion on a military target is no longer a matter of conjecture. Never before have such complex and devastating energies been available for military use. Never before has disaster struck with such sudden violence, so compressed in time and space. When the atom bomb explodes, everything happens at once. At ground zero, directly below the explosion, piles of brick, stone, and concrete rubble mark the center of destruction and the high point of human mortality. On sites where factories once stood, wrecked machines are the only identifying feature. A few empty hulks of earthquake-resistant steel and concrete structures bear witness to the crushing force of the blast. In the few buildings which remain standing, the roofs are collapsed by the vertical pressure of the blast. The occupants are crushed under the wreckage or trapped in the burning debris. Those in the open are instantly charred by temperatures of thousands of degrees, and a moment later are struck by the mechanical force of the blast. Those who take refuge in deep underground shelters survive. Otherwise, the area near the target center is one of nearly total loss in buildings and in humans, victims of the multiple effects of the bomb. Farther from the center of the blast, the destruction, although not complete, is extremely severe. Even those buildings which remain standing offer slight protection. The extended pressures of the blast penetrate through windows and doors to building interiors, where the ensuing fires finish the job. In this area, the blast effect is exerted slantingly downward rather than vertically. Whole buildings are displaced bodily from their foundations. The extended blast, exerted over entire surfaces, causes a general distortion rather than the localized penetration of conventional explosives. Factory buildings are collapsed as though by the pressure of a giant hand. On buildings with weight-bearing walls of stone or brick, the pressure has a devastating effect. Frame structures are demolished. The debris is a prolific source of fires from short circuits and cooking stoves. Much of the firefighting apparatus is destroyed, while rubble-filled streets close the area to the equipment which remains. From the area of severe destruction, some of the injured are able to make their way to comparative safety in the outer limits of the city. In the outer reaches of the target, the destruction is less severe and reflects the sheltering contour of the terrain. Destruction by fire varies freakishly with the direction of the wind. Even at the outermost limits of destruction, flying debris and splintered glass cause a great variety of minor casualties. On the periphery of the target, there is an immense zone of minor to moderate damage. Within it, an intermediate zone of severe destruction. At the center, a zone of absolute, total devastation. The bomb, in addition to its unprecedented destructiveness, is particularly effective as a casualty-producing agent. In the central zone of complete destruction, a large majority die within the first few hours from the combined effects of heat and blast. Many of those not killed are seriously injured. In the intermediate zone, the mortality from heat and blast falls off sharply, and the number of injured survivors greatly increases. In the outer zone, while relatively few are killed, there are many injuries, mostly of a minor nature. This is the typical picture of the bomb's thermal and traumatic effects. But superimposed over these conventional effects are the novel effects of atomic radiation. Depending upon the altitude of the explosion, neutrons reach the ground in greater or lesser quantities, but are effective mainly at the center of the target. Gamma rays, however, blanket the two inner zones of the target area and a small part of the outer zone. Their intensity is greatest directly under the bomb, diminishing rapidly at greater distances from the source. Little effective radiation dosage occurs beyond the intermediate zone. Radiation dosage depends partly upon distance from the explosion. It also varies with the shielding afforded by intervening materials. The greater the thickness of a given material, the greater the absorption and the less the effective dosage. The denser the material, the greater the protection afforded. Concrete is a better shielding material than an equal thickness of brick. Less dense materials, such as wood and plaster, offer virtually no protection. Light frame buildings give little or no protection. Many storage structures of massive steel and concrete do offer a degree of safety, particularly in the lower floors and cellar and away from windows. Individual dosage by gamma rays depends upon the twin factors of distance from the source and shielding. Maximum exposure occurs near the target center where many, virtually unshielded, receive extremely severe dosages. A smaller number receive effective but non-lethal dosages. Farther from the center, the dosage is less severe. Relatively few are affected, and many receive no radiation. The combined effects of radiation, plus those from heat and blast, produce an early mortality in the center zone of nearly 100%. With so many forces operating, death cannot be ascribed to any one cause. In the intermediate zone, the early death rate is lower, with a great increase in injured survivors. Few are uninjured. In the peripheral zone, most casualties sustain minor damage. Few die, and many escape uninjured. The injured survivors constitute the treatment problem as the medical services must face it a few hours after the moment of detonation. A simple graph representing thousands of individual casualties produced simultaneously in one city by one bomb, detonated at optimum altitude over the center of a flat target area. The casualty statistics are staggering. Assuming the bomb strikes an unprepared and unalerted city of all over population density of 1 person per 1,000 square feet, with a total population of 250,000, it is estimated that approximately 40,000 will die outright. 140,000 will be injured, of whom a further proportion will subsequently die. The intermediate zone contains most of the injured survivors and a great majority of the more serious casualties. The medical services must direct their main effort toward this intermediate area of severe destruction. Of those injured, nearly half are burned. An equal number sustain traumatic injury, although usually of a minor nature, since the seriously injured survive only by virtue of organized rescue. In many patients, burns and trauma are found together. An additional number show radiation effects without other complications. Often, radiation is combined with conventional injuries, particularly near the central zone. While the effects of radiation may not be immediately apparent, the thousands who have sustained trauma and burns are in instant need of treatment. The crisis is heightened by the sudden destruction of medical facilities in the target area. Most of the hospitals are rendered nearly or completely useless. Doctors and nurses in centrally located hospitals and clinics suffer extremely high casualties. Medical supplies and equipment are largely destroyed. The medical services, unprepared for disaster, are eliminated as an effective organization. The patients are numbered by scores of thousands. Their injuries are combined, not simple. This is something new, without example in previous human experience. The history of modern war affords no valid parallel. In typical bombing with conventional high explosives, immediate countermeasures go into effect. All energies are concentrated on the work of defense. When fires break out, firefighting equipment goes into action to confine and localize the damage. Rescue squads converge on the foci of destruction. First aid teams penetrate the beleaguered area to administer emergency medical care. Serious cases are removed immediately to prepared medical stations where well-staffed facilities accommodate the sudden influx of patients. Throughout the bombardment, community services continue to function. Telephones work. Water runs. The injured are rescued. Streets remain open. Factories continue to produce. People remain at their jobs. Trains enter and leave the city. population finds protection underground and survives. After the attack, the fires subside. The city digs out. The localized damage is absorbed and repaired. The living bury the dead. The city weathers the crisis and survives as a going concern. These are the essential facts of conventional bombing. However severe, it occurs piecemeal and is fought piecemeal. It is localized in space. It is spread out in time. But with the atomic bomb, mass destruction gains a new dimension. In the absence of planning, local administration and authority end. The main links in the chain of responsibility are broken. The bombed community is rudderless, unprotected and helpless at the moment of crisis. The streets are closed. There is no transportation and no fire control. There is no firefighting equipment. The water does not run. There are no public services. No electricity. There is no communication. Production ceases. Hospitals are neither well-staffed nor well-equipped. The fragments of the medical plant that do survive exist in a virtual vacuum. In atomic bombing, there are two essential factors. It is total. It happens all over. It is simultaneous. It all happens at once.
A century ago, most farmers used tools as crude as this ox-drawn plow. Through the years, improvements in machines and crops increased farm productivity and decreased farm drudgery. Keeping pace with developments in modern industry, farming became so mechanized that further improvement seemed almost impossible. But now the radioactive atom is leading agriculturalists into a whole new era of development. Such age-old problems as how to increase the production of milk, meat, and eggs can now be approached by applying techniques made possible through atomic science. For example, despite the research of generations of agriculturalists, much remains unknown about the most effective use of the soil. With radioactive isotopes now available, a new and promising means of studying such problems is at hand. Radioisotopes are elements that release radioactivity. Radioactive elements such as phosphorus, calcium, sulfur, boron, and carbon are used to study the processes that go on in living plants and animals. Plant experiments using radioactive elements often depend upon the tracer technique. That is, the radioactive atoms travel through a living body and enter into chemical reactions. These atoms can be detected by the radiations they release, so that it is theoretically possible to trace them and find out where they have entered into the living processes. Here, a typical experiment with a radioisotope is getting underway at an agricultural research center. A compound containing radiocalcium is weighed.
and blended with the soil. In the greenhouse, plants are grown in soil containing a calcium radioisotope. By distributing the isotope at different distances from the plant roots, the agronomist can learn answers to the important problems of how to distribute fertilizer for maximum effectiveness. Whatever the plants, some of the atoms of radioactive calcium make their way into the plant roots, up the stems, and out into the leaves of the plant. After plants grown under such conditions have developed, they're harvested and checked for radioactivity to determine just how much calcium has been taken up and utilized and the effects of the different amounts of calcium on their growth. Intense radioactivity greatly affects plant growth. In this experiment, a source of radiation called cobalt-60 is located inside the hollow pole. Gamma rays are released by the cobalt. Plants nearest the pole are seriously stunted by the radiations. Plants further away show little or no visible damage. Conditions affecting plants can be carefully controlled in growth chambers like this. Plants here are being affected by a source of radiation to produce internal changes. The source of the radiation is in the lead container. The container is closed when the botanist is in the room to prevent personal injury. Samples of plants affected by irradiation are collected for study. Samples of cells from the leaves and other parts of the plant are prepared for the microscope. Under the microscope, we can study the chromosomes, chain-like structures that determine the characteristics inherited by future generations. These chromosomes have been split by radiations. Unattached fragments are one result of such damage. Broken ends of the chromosomes may try to rejoin. If there is only one break, the ends rejoin in only one way. But if there has been a break in several chromosome chains, the different ends may rejoin in new combinations, which may greatly affect the heredity of future generations. Radioactive cobalt is affecting the corn in this field. One of the agronomists uses a windlass to lower the radioactive source into the ground, where its radiations will be absorbed. By controlling the pollination of the corn plants, the agronomist lays the foundation for studying the effects of radiation on future generations of corn. In this experiment, the pollen from the tassel of a plant is sprinkled on the ear of the same plant. The ear is covered so that the pollen from other plants will not reach it. When the ear of this self-pollinated plant ripens, its seeds and the plants grown from them can be studied to detect hereditary changes due to irradiation. From some of these seeds may develop new strains of corn. Chemists are also using radioactivity to study photosynthesis, the plant's food-making process. Photosynthesis depends essentially upon combining carbon dioxide and water to produce plant foods such as sugar. The basic process seems simple enough, until it is known that the plant first makes a number of intermediate chemicals before producing sugar. With radiocarbon now available, chemists at last have a tool for studying this complicated process. By replacing the ordinary carbon dioxide that reaches the plant with carbon dioxide rich in radiocarbon, the plant produces radioactive molecules. By detecting these radioactive chemicals produced at different stages in the plant's growth, chemists may finally learn the secrets of photosynthesis. Some of the experiments with photosynthesis begin with plants called algae. A stream of radioactive carbon dioxide is piped into the container where the algae grow. Artificial light starts the photosynthesis process. After a few seconds, the process is stopped by killing the algae with a boiling hot alcohol solution. The problems to solve are what compounds have been formed and in what amounts. The test begins by spreading a small amount of extract from the algae on a piece of special paper. After the extract dries, an X-ray film is pressed against the paper so that the different radioactive compounds from the extract on the paper record their own pictures. In addition, the amount of each chemical, even though a mere trace, can be accurately measured using a radiation counter. The objective of such research is to learn how to produce food independent of nature. Radioactive studies are being made with animals as well as plants. For example, cud-chewing animals become anemic, like these cows, if cobalt is lacking in their diet. Why is this so? With radiocobalt, the answer has been discovered. Radiocobalt, shown as white dots, has been traced through the cow's system. Bacteria, shown as black dots, live in the animal's second stomach called the rumen. Now, these bacteria can produce vitamin B12, but they do so only when cobalt is available. Producing vitamin B12 is important because B12 prevents anemia in cud-chewing animals. Tests have been made to find out how much cobalt is needed by each animal to keep it healthy. Producers of sheep have long realized that one element, sulfur, plays an especially important part in the formation of wool. That is because sulfur is an important part of the 2 amino acids that make up a large part of wool. But to ensure a maximum crop of wool, how much sulfur should be fed? And should it be fed as an element or in a compound? When radiosulfur became available, tests were begun. Test sheep were fed radiosulfur. Later, the wool was checked to see how completely the sheep had converted the sulfur into the amino acid compounds in wool. Out of such experiments, discoveries have come that will enable sheep ranchers to increase wool production and possibly improve the quality of wool. Laying hens, too, have been the subjects of radiotracer studies. One problem has been to find out how hens use phosphorus and calcium to produce eggs. In experiments, laying hens have been fed radiophosphorus and radiocalcium. Some of the radioactive material enters into the egg, its shell, its yolk, and its white. The eggs can be tested for radioactive content. By knowing how much radioactive material has been fed, and by finding out how much can be detected in each part of the egg, the experimenter learns how the hen uses calcium and phosphorus to build egg components. So radioisotopes are providing new methods of studying agricultural problems, methods that are remarkable because they do not harm living bodies or interfere with their life processes. So far, the results from using radioisotopes in agriculture are not spectacular, but they are proving extremely helpful in solving basic problems. Great improvements in the quality and quantity of plant and animal products may be within reach. And based upon preliminary experiments with photosynthesis, it is conceivable that man may ultimately free himself from dependence upon nature for his food supply. All because man is learning to make the radioactive atom his servant.
Mid-afternoon, USA. A community like thousands of others throughout the country, like your community. You are a housewife doing your shopping, or a little girl out walking the dog. You're a boy trying out your new baseball glove. You're a construction worker with a day off, catching up on some chores around the house. Or a senior citizen catching up on his dreams. Suddenly something happens. Something that halts the normal routine of your day. Your nation has become the target of a nuclear attack. To prevent you from being a casualty, you must stop what you are doing and be prepared to take cover, most likely in a public shelter. What will you do there? How will you react? How will you adjust to the new and different way of life you will encounter living in a public shelter? In our projected situation, a nuclear detonation has taken place several hundred miles from this community. Dangerous radioactive fallout is being carried downwind toward the area. This is one of several public fallout shelters in the town with a trained shelter manager and staff. Donald Barnes attended a shelter management course given by an instructor who had received federally sponsored training. Barnes knows the importance of prompt organization within the shelter for the welfare of the occupants. In this shelter, each person is given a registration form which will indicate important data about the occupant. The form provides a ready means to determine the skills and capabilities of the occupants, which may be used in the various shelter functions. Not all shelters will be organized or operated in the same manner. Procedures will depend on the size of the shelter, its floor plan, facilities, supplies, and the availability of trained personnel. Where the number of occupants is large enough, a supervisor for each shelter function may be needed. Members of the community who have prepared themselves with training in civil defense adult education courses, or in such areas as disaster aid or medical self-help, can provide valuable guidance in the shelter situation. Housewife Lenore Payton has listed on her registration form that she had taken a Red Cross home nursing course. In the absence of professional medical personnel, Manager Barnes assigns her the job of nurse. A section has been set aside as a first aid area. Mrs. Payton will check the medical supplies and arrange facilities for care of the sick and injured. To Hal Benton, construction worker and former military policeman, goes the assignment of security and control, a necessary function in any situation where many people are confined in a limited area for a length of time. Seeking solace in this time of trial, office worker Bert Gaines finds in himself a native ability to comfort others, to bring them spiritual guidance and hope. The alert shelter manager is always on the watch for the emergent leader who can help to ease the burden of shelter living. Gaines is asked to serve as religious counselor. Carrie Wilkins, cashier at a supermarket, is put in charge of vital food and water supplies. Mrs. Wilkins will keep a careful check on these provisions and their handling and distribution. This includes those provisions furnished by the federal government in shelters which meet certain basic requirements. In many shelters, these will be the only provisions available. Other assignments are made to complete the supervision of key shelter functions. The first meal in the shelter. To facilitate the procedure, the shelter population is grouped into units, each with its own leader selected from the occupants, who keeps a record of the rations issued to the people in his unit. Water is stored on the basis of 3.5 gallons per person in the shelter. Federal rations provide 10,000 calories per person. Additional food items may be added to shelter provisions by the community. These might include special foods for persons with dietary needs, utensils for cooking and washing, and additional water rations for cleaning and washing.
We're going to be in this shelter for an undetermined length of time. Now, this is a new and different experience for all of us. It will require understanding, tolerance, and cooperation on the part of all. It will be necessary to establish certain rules and regulations to ensure our safety. As your shelter manager, I urge you to observe them. Now, procedures have been set up for efficient shelter functions, and I would like to explain these to you. Number one, medical facilities.
Early orientation of the occupants is vital so that they will have some idea of what lies ahead. In his responsibility as shelter manager, Barnes' legal status and authority must be made clear to the occupants. Above all, he must have their confidence from the beginning if he is to do his job efficiently. He discusses with them the shelter staff and organization, the facilities available, operating procedures, the daily schedule. He emphasizes their dependence on one another in the shelter situation and the need for a helping hand. Questions are asked and answered as frankly as possible. No attempt is made to hide the seriousness of the situation, but the shelter manager uses his own discretion in seeing that the occupants are not needlessly upset. Health of the occupants is a major consideration. Anyone with a special medical condition is asked to notify the appointed nurse, who collects medications and keeps them in a central place. Sickness in the shelter can present a very serious problem, and preventive measures against illness are taken wherever possible. People in a stress situation often find comfort in religion. The religious counselor sees that everyone who seeks the consolation of his faith is given the opportunity for counsel, meditation, or prayer. Bedtime. Planning by the community has provided enough cots for most of this shelter population. Not furnished by the federal government, cots and other comfort items are the responsibility of each community. Martin Crayola, operator of a hardware store, knows something about inventories and schedules and has been put in charge of sleeping arrangements. He prepares a sleeping schedule which will allow everyone in each group a chance to get some rest. The shelter is secured for the night. An ideal time for a smoke. But smoking is permitted only when the shelter management determines the ventilation in the area and oxygen requirements. These will naturally vary in different shelters. While most of the occupants sleep, an important part of shelter operations is to provide a constant watch for emergency and the unexpected. A night watch ensures continuous and safe operation. Around the clock, communications equipment is monitored for news of outside developments or instructions from the town Civil Defense Emergency Operations Center. Telephone could be operable where fallout was a hazard, but blast and heat effects were minimal. A change of shift and time for radiological survey, one of the most important shelter activities which goes on night and day. The dosimeter is used to register the total radiation dose. A trained specialist, the radiological monitor keeps track of radiation levels within the shelter so that a complete record of the dose and dose rate is available. Morning, and the shelter routine settles down. Occupants must get used to new ways in an environment still strange to them. Chemical sanitation facilities. With many of the conveniences of personal care no longer available, cleanliness and personal hygiene become more important than ever. In the mass situation, every precaution must be taken against infection and disease. Various in-shelter programs, such as a demonstration on medical self-help, stimulate interest among the occupants and provide training in important shelter needs. Other training may be presented on such subjects as the care and handling of food supplies, health and sanitation, safety and fire prevention, or any subject related to the well-being of the occupant during his shelter stay.
We've received the following message from the mayor of our town. Your city government has prepared itself to deal with this type of situation. We are ready to care for our people. The radiation level in the community is still too high to undertake any outdoor activity. Remain in your shelters. We will keep you informed of local conditions. Again, let me emphasize the need of remaining in your shelter.
One of the great needs of the shelter occupant is to know what is going on outside. An information vacuum is detrimental to morale. Shelter management is responsible for keeping the people informed. Messages from government authorities and news of outside conditions are conveyed to the occupants as often as possible. For their part, shelter occupants must begin thinking about their responsibility to aid in recovery when they return to their community. Rumors flourish more easily in the stress situation, and care will be taken by the shelter management that only accurate, clear, and concise information is presented. Recreational programs fill an urgent need to limber up muscles stiff from confinement in the small area, to provide mental relaxation. For some people, adjustment will be more difficult than for others.
Is there anything I can do, Mrs. Warren?
It's the not knowing that makes it so hard. Not knowing what's happened to them.
Your family?
My husband and my little boy. Mark's only 5. My husband took him down to the plant to show him the equipment. Oh, Mark's awfully good with his hands. My husband thinks he'll make a good machinist. When he grows up.
Mrs. Warren, the latest list of the people in other shelters has just arrived.
I've checked them all.
This one just came in. I'll take a look and see if they're on it. Is your husband's name Neil?
No, Robert.
In large cities, early receipt of such lists is unlikely, but every effort will be made to keep the shelter occupants informed.
Here we are. Robert and Mark Warren. They're in the shelter at the factory.
Let me see.
Reactions to stress are as varied as human personality itself.
What are we doing in here anyway? We'd be just as well off taking our chances on the outside.
You're lucky we have people here who know how to handle things. We've got a lot of people in this place to look after. Why don't you pull yourself together? Help us calm some of these other folks. Mr. Gaines over here could use a little assistance.
I just put the geraniums in last spring. They've done fine. The soil is real good. I've been building it up for years with compost. My wife used to say, even tin cans could grow in that soil, the way I took care of it. What's going to happen to it now? Don't know what I would do without my garden. It's all I have.
It's the government's fault. They got us into this. We pay taxes, and we have a right to expect them to prevent this sort of thing from happening.
I know how you feel. But remember, we're the government. You and I and all the rest. And we didn't start this war, the enemy did. But we did provide shelters for our safety, just like this one. And with your help and that of all the rest, we'll make out all right.
Resentment, anger, anxiety, grief. These are a few of the psychological responses that may result from the shelter situation. There may even be overt antisocial behavior which might jeopardize the safety of the other occupants. Necessary measures to maintain order and security will be taken by the shelter management. Some shelters have a forced ventilation system. It may be inoperative during some portions of the shelter stay. In this situation, discomfort of the occupant increases. Human tolerance to temperature rises in confined areas, has limitations, and dangerous levels can be reached. Depending on time, place, and population, shelters may be more crowded than the one you see here. Normal requirements are an average of 10 square feet of floor space per person. Almost 2 weeks have passed. There has been some illness. Some of the occupants have developed headaches, but their ordeal is nearly over. Some remain disturbed. Others have accepted the situation. Occupants are thrown back on their individual resources to pass the time.
There's a little white duck swimming in the water, a little white duck, and she knew she had a daughter. She swam out to the lily pad, saw Mr. Frog, and he looked so sad.
One question is foremost in their minds. How long will they have to remain in the shelter? The answer depends on several factors, primarily on the radiological situation in the area outside. The most important thing for the occupants to remember is, the longer the shelter wait, the less danger because fallout decays with time. The Emergency Operations Center authorities will decide when people should leave the shelter. It is a vital decision, and it is made only after the fullest possible information about the local situation has been obtained. The shelter manager will present reasons for staying or reasons why it would be better to go, so that the shelter occupants are fully informed. Periodic reports have confirmed that the radioactivity has been decaying steadily. Now it appears it will be reasonably safe to permit departure from the shelter for short periods of time. Plans are made for emergence. First, a group will be permitted to leave the shelter for rooms in the same area. Later, work details will be sent out to help restore normal community functions. Finally, there will be permanent emergence. Remember that life in a shelter will not be like living under normal conditions. Suppose, in our story, there had been no shelter, no plan, no organization, no trained personnel. Suppose no one was there who understood the nature of the problems the shelter occupants faced. Suppose no one had known when or if ever there would be hope of returning to a life previously known. In the perilous world of this nuclear age, shelter is protection. Community shelter planning will result in the best use of our shelter facilities. Should the siren sound, would your community be ready with the kind of shelter preparation you have just seen? Would you be better prepared, or would you not be prepared at all? Shelter living will be what you, the community, make it, what you have provided for. That our normal, everyday way of life may not be suspended, this is our wish and our hope. But housewife, children, working man, the aged. In our own interest, all of us should have some idea of what to expect if our survival should ever depend on living in a public shelter.
What does one under the influence of LSD hear, see, and do? We're about to take you into the world of the LSD user, a world that to him is real, yet as terrifying and unreal as anything ever imagined. We call his trip of terror to fly a giant bird.
Among these are persons who may be suffocating or who may have a hemorrhage. Another injury which must be attended to before moving a person is a fracture. Fractures may comprise the greatest number of injuries following a major disaster. This wall might collapse. In other situations, it might be danger from fire or an explosion or a live electrical wire. Do not lift the victim. Drag him to safety, but do not move him any further than absolutely necessary. If he has a fracture, any movement of the involved part may cause additional injury. This is the first rule in treating a fracture victim. Do not move him except to drag him away from immediate danger. How do you know there is a fracture? In many cases, you cannot be sure, but in every case where a broken bone may have occurred, you must assume it has occurred and handle the situation accordingly. If you must remove the victim's clothing in order to examine the injury, cut the clothing away rather than lift or move the limb. Inspection is necessary, however, in order for you to determine what type of fracture exists and to decide what immediate steps must be taken to prevent complication. Here is one type of